Hey, welcome back to the KRUSE Elite Podcast. What's up, Tony?
Good morning, Taylor. Look what I found.
Oh, are those aren't pinholes, but those glasses are, well, they're pinholes, but they're lines.
It's almost like looking through some like blinds or shutters.
Yep.
But basically they're plastic glasses with just horizontal bars across them. And I think they were like a prop at some party that I worked at.
Yeah.
And they were just handing these out. But they do block a good amount of light.
Yeah, I've never tried those. But that's probably really similar to pinholes.
So I was going to ask, because unlike pinholes where it's kind of like a crosshatch pattern, and so you're getting less light kind of in points all over, this is straight horizontal bars.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if it's occluding more of like the up-down vision, but it's allowing for like the wider horizontal to peripheral vision.
That's very interesting. I wonder what the difference would be, like specifically. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was wondering too. I was like, is this useful in some way from like a targeting perspective? If I wanted to limit just my kind of vertical spread of vision,
right,
but keep my horizontal vision as wide as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of that is, I don't know exactly what it's like to have those on, but I do wonder do you have this, like, are you sort of perceiving the lines going across? Like, can you actually?
Yeah, they're a little blurry, but like I'm looking right through them, right? It's like close enough to my eye where I'm like, I can tell they're there, but I'm also can see through them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I do notice is way less like up and down freedom to see.
That's interesting. Lines matter. The way that the brain perceives lines, vertical versus horizontal, they really do matter. It's weird. You can even test lines. I played around with a friend of mine who started out as kind of a colleague through continued ed courses and stuff. We became good buddies, and he was visiting us once and we were nerding out, and he's like, let's test lines. And so we basically were putting visual pictures in front of our face of either vertical lines, horizontal lines, or curved lines.
Interesting.
And then because with, the way that the receptors respond to the different pattern, it's like kind of a pattern recognition thing. Mm-hmm. You can get completely different responses looking at shapes, essentially. It's pretty wild. And we did. We were doing like little range of motion tests and like strength tests and finding like differences in the shapes in the lines. And it's really interesting.
Yeah. That makes me wonder. I've got these like vertical lines on my acoustic treatment that are meant to like disperse the sound in certain ways.
Yeah.
But basically I'm looking at all these lines around my studio, like up and down. I wonder what that's doing.
Yeah. Yeah. You can tell, you can just put a piece of paper in front of your face and draw one vertical line or several vertical lines, test it, change it to horizontal, test curved lines. You can even use that application can be used when you're doing like vision training or vision rehab stuff. You can actually choose visual targets or backgrounds that actually use the type of shape or line that is working for you best. Mm-hmm. I have heard a story through another colleague a while ago that they had to rehab somebody's ability to handle curved lines, which is really bizarre to think about. For some reason, I don't know the background of this, like much of the background of the story, but it was through a lot of extensive testing and vision work, they found out that somebody was basically very sensitive to curved lines, like threat. So they had to incorporate that, I think, little by little, exposing the person to more and more curved lines in their vision rehab, which is interesting.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I also know some people have like a strong aversion to like polka dots. That like really like freaks some people out. And I just wonder like what's going on in the brain there that's coming out. Like curved lines, I could almost imagine like, oh, maybe that's almost like the bare minimum representation of a snake to that like primal part of your brain.
That's a very interesting way to think about it. Yeah. A lot of this stuff is survival based. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe polka dots, it's like, that's like, maybe predators or poisonous animals have dots. And so
I think
like
that
a thing.
that could be part of it. I mean, I get that, there's a lot of that with color too.
Yeah. So much more to learn.
Yeah.
Not enough time.
It's true.
But at least on this podcast, we have some things that we're definitely going to learn today. And today we are going to talk about the neurology of posture.
Right.
Posture being one that I think all of us can kind of relate to, or most of us can kind of relate to.
Right.
I don't know if you had like your mom or your grandparent or someone who would tell you to sit up straight, or your teacher, someone would poke you in the back to make sure you, kind of arch your back and sit up straight. But yeah, posture is one that I think we all aspire to better posture, right? And so, yeah, it'd be really cool to understand a little bit more about what's going on in your brain that could be affecting your posture.
Absolutely. Posture is a big topic. It's something that never, we see a lot of trends in the fitness world and in the movement and rehab world. A lot of things people are interested in, and they come and they go, and we usually circle back to them. But posture is kind of always there. People are always asking me about posture, even, on social media and stuff. People are wondering, why do my shoulders roll in, or why do I have a forward head posture, or some people call it like a tech neck, right? There's all these names for this stuff. There's lots of names for this stuff, and they all are describing some kind of shape that the body is carrying. And people get focused on what they believe might be a postural issue because the shape of the body doesn't look as ideal as they want it to, or maybe there's posture issues and pain issues. And a lot of times we like to relate pain problems to posture issues. And, that's a whole conversation in itself, because even poor posture doesn't equal pain, right? There's some interesting things to kind of unpack there. But posture is, I think, probably the most misunderstood thing that exists in the movement world. I really do think so. It's like the industry is always talking about it, but the conversation never ever seems to go further than muscles, right? It's like, okay, you've got poor posture. You've got that rounded upper back that some people call kyphosis. Well, we must need to strengthen your back muscles and release your pec muscles. Because in theory, if you were working on, let's say, a model of a person that was made of clay, that's kind of what you would do. You would kind of mold the person, and, it's kind of like, all right, if we strengthen the stuff on the back, that's going to shorten it and maybe make the person, bring the person up taller, but we got to release the stuff in the front, or else we can't make that adjustment and it won't hold. That's where people are with their mindset still with posture. And it's so much bigger than that. It is truly something extremely holistic, involving all kinds of higher order systems that we're going to talk about today. Your eyes, your inner ear, the vestibular system, your breathing system, your airway, your emotions. Man, there's so much that goes into this. Posture is truly holistic, right? It's really a symphony of all these different systems working together to express what is the person's posture. And the interesting thing about this that I've really observed over the years is that there is not really a perfect posture, right? It's not like we can say, okay, this is it, because each person is different. Their brain and nervous system is doing the best it can with the resources it has. And not everyone's posture is always going to look the same. We can have what we might look at as a postural issue, and that person has chronic pain, right? We've seen that. But we've also seen the person that has what would be considered poor posture, and they're pain-free. So then the question is, why does somebody with such lousy posture not have any pain? And then the athlete comes around who's standing up nice and tall, is always training, has good conditioning. You look at their body and you go, wow, this is posturally, this is a nice physique, right? Mm-hmm. Shoulders stacked over pelvis, nice and tall through the crown. Everything looks in alignment, yet they have chronic back pain or chronic neck pain. And we see that all the time. All right. So there's a lot of big questions that come up. It's like, well, does bad posture equal pain? It's very interesting. And that by itself displays that there's a lot more to it than just muscles, right? There's a lot more to it than just strengthening muscles or releasing muscles. So there's a lot to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it might be good to kind of start with that. I'll call it the classical model of posture, and that's that idea you were just talking about. Like, okay, if you've got kyphosis, if your upper back is bent over, just strengthening the upper back muscles and releasing those pec muscles.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of useful to start there, since so many of us start there, right, in our conception, right?
Right.
I think a lot of people notice a change when they focus on upper back lifts. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, in the holistic model, what do you think is going on there where, the day after doing upper back work, they're feeling like they're standing a little taller?
Right. So you can get postural changes from proprioceptive work. There's no question. Typically what we see, if we're looking at a relatively significant change in posture that we're trying to work with, you typically are not going to see the carryover at least stick for as long as you would like it to. Mm-hmm. Right. But sometimes through good exercise, in that case, working on, muscles of the posterior chain, the extensor group, those anti-gravity muscles that help us stand up taller, you absolutely can improve posture that way, but it's super limited, right? Because people tend to look at muscles as if they have a mind of their own, right? It's going back to that like idea of molding the clay. Like if I work my upper back, I'm going to change my upper back. And therefore, if I shorten the muscles and contract the muscles, they're going to hold. And muscle tone does not necessarily work that way, right? A lot of our muscle tone, or really all of our muscle tone, is controlled by systems, neurologic systems, circuitry, things that are reflexive in nature. And it's designed that way because you don't want to have to invest conscious energy into standing up taller or holding up your posture. Mm-hmm. If you did that, it would waste a lot of energy, and eventually you probably would not feel good from that. Imagine fixing your posture, standing up tall, holding your shoulders back, and doing that over and over and over again. Yeah, it wouldn't feel good, right? And how can you keep track of that while you're actually moving, right, through the world? So we tend to think of muscles as this organ, this structure that has its own brain, and it doesn't work that way. Muscles are actually receiving, let's say, orders on what to do from these other systems. And we can start to unpack those systems because a lot of it is coming from our eyes in our inner ear. In fact, your main source of descending postural control comes from your vestibular system. So your vestibular system is that compass that we have that lives in the inner ear that helps us understand where we are in space, which way we're going, and which way is up. Very simply put, it helps you understand where your head is it tells your brain where your head is. Your head and your neck. Your body too, but to simplify it, it's very much about the head and the neck. So we have to have a good functioning vestibular system, a healthy vestibular system that is interpreting sensory inputs coming in very clearly and is also sending the appropriate descending signals to postural muscles. So muscles of the posterior chain. Think about all the muscles on the back of the body, along the spine. We mentioned the upper back, the neck, the pelvis. This even goes into the lower body. Those are our posterior chain muscles, the anti-gravity ones that help us fight gravity. And your vestibular system is basically the main system that's helping us fight gravity. So we cannot have the conversation about posture without also talking about the vestibular system, because some of those orders I mentioned that are coming from these higher order systems to give muscles the appropriate amount of tone, a lot of that is coming from the inner ear, which is very weird to hear at first. It's like, wait, it's not my rhomboids and my upper traps and my mid traps. They don't have a brain or control center themselves. They're actually receiving orders from something else. That's interesting. All right. And so a lot of this most of it is reflexive in nature, and that control is not voluntary at all. In fact, we don't want it to be.
Right. We don't want to be consciously thinking about our posture throughout every movement and everything we do.
Totally. It'd just be so energy expensive.
So maybe the vestibular system is the place to start. How would you relate the overall function and health of the vestibular system to posture in applied neurology?
Yeah, so it's not really, you can't really separate it from the eyes. So there's, these two, your visual system and your vestibular system are working together for sure. Our listeners can think about, in terms of posture, our listeners can think about vision telling the brain where the horizon is, right? Because that's a very fundamental way to look at what are our eyes actually doing for us in terms of like pattern recognition. And one of those things is they are really trying to figure out like what is the horizon so that we can orient ourselves relative to that. And it kind of comes back to some of what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode here with lines, because so much of what we interpret in our world, in our environment, coming into our eyes is based on lines and pattern recognition. So your eyes are always sort of searching for what might be the horizon to help orient us upright. And your vestibular system tells, your brain where your head and neck is, and also is involved in how is your body moving. Because posture, we have to remember, is not static, right? We typically tend to think about posture as, okay, what's your posture like while you're just standing there or sitting there? And that's a part of posture, because in order to stand there or sit there upright, you're still dealing with gravity, and you still have resting tone in your tissues, your muscles and your connective tissues that are helping you stay upright. But posture is not just static, it's dynamic too. So you have to be able to maintain what is an optimal posture, let's say, as you're moving. And more importantly, you have to be able to maintain an optimal posture as you're moving through the world with lots of interference in other sensory inputs coming in. So we can't really just look at it as static. And that's, again, where our eyes and our inner ear really help us, especially our vestibular system being the compass that is helping our brain understand how we're moving. Like, are we moving forwards? Are we moving backwards? Are we moving side to side or up and down? We have very specific pieces of anatomy in the inner ear that measure the accelerations of head and neck movement as we move through the world, and also body movement very linearly, again, like all directions, really. And so those pieces of anatomy, those parts of the the inner ear, the ones that help our brain understand the forward and backward and side to side movements and the up and down ones, that comes from the otoliths of the inner ear. And the head and neck accelerations, like imagine you're an athlete, you're running down the field, you quickly turn your head to receive the ball, right? Because you're looking at where the ball is going to come from. Or you're out for a walk with your friend and you are talking to them as you guys are walking side by side, and you're periodically turning your head to the right as you talk. Then you're looking forwards. Then you're turning your head to the right as you talk, and then you're looking forwards. Those head and neck movements that we kind of take for granted, we don't really recognize them as turning up in all these places in our life. Those are the sensors that sense those head and neck movements are mostly connected to what is known as the semicircular canals of the vestibular system. So that's a different area. So that's different anatomy from the otoliths. So there's different aspects of the anatomy that help us essentially organize our movement and our posture, whether we are just stationary, standing upright, sitting upright, or actually moving through the world.
So you have these vestibular components, your otolith, your semicircular canals. Mm-hmm. They're the compasses. I just imagine 2 compass balls in your ears.
Perfect.
That's kind of,
yeah.
And there's up, which is kind of like north, right? Mm-hmm. It's always there. But then there's the cardinal direction. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice 3-dimensional compass. And then there's your eyes that are supporting what those compasses in your ears are telling you.
Exactly.
So, if I feel like with my eyes closed, up is a certain, angle, and I open my eyes and that visual information confirms that, then, everything's copacetic. But if I open my eyes and the horizon is slanted,
yes,
and it looks really off compared to how my brain thinks it should, then I might have a sensory mismatch, and then I might have problems.
Exactly. That's the sensory mismatch idea.
Okay.
Yeah. And so go ahead.
And I was just going to say, in my example, I'm imagining like something really totally bizarrely off. But in reality, it might even just be a tiny degree.
Oh my goodness.
Off.
Let me describe the tiny degree. This is, so there's an assessment that I have not used it much in the past couple years because I'm not really doing any one-on-one in-person stuff currently. Most of my time and energy has been going into teaching. Mm-hmm. I do some online sessions, but I can't do this particular assessment really online very easily. So I've gravitated away from it for now, but it's a very interesting one. So I used to do this a lot with people that I thought had more vestibular concerns, and we called it the bucket test. And we used an app called Visual Vertical. And you take a big bucket, a large one, like a construction grade, large bucket. And you take your phone, you've got this app, and we used to Velcro the phone into the bucket, on the bottom of the bucket. And you would have the client take the bucket and cover their face with it so that their head was inside of the bucket. So at this point, all you can see is bucket and phone. And we pivot the bucket or rotate it, and then the coach grabs the bucket. So now the client is not holding it. They're just in, their face is just inside the bucket, and they can't see anything else. They don't know where the horizon is, right? They can't use their peripheral vision. It's all bucket. Mm-hmm. And what happens here is kind of like a level. The coach starts to slowly rotate the bucket back to what would be vertical. And the leveling device on the app will give you a reading after you do this for what is actually vertical. So here's what we do. So as the coach, I'll say, okay, client, I'm going to rotate the bucket very slowly. And I want you to say stop when you think the line, because there's a vertical line on the screen of the phone, when you think the line has arrived at a perfectly vertical position. So I rotate it, and then they go stop. And as soon as it stops, the app basically takes a reading. And we might do 3 of them. You might try it 3 times, and then the app takes an average or something, or we take the average of what the person perceives as perfectly vertical. And what you find with people that have vestibular issues and sensory mismatch, as you mentioned, is that once you take away the dominance of the visual system by limiting the input that they're getting from the outside world because their face is in a bucket, and they have to rely more on their understanding of where vertical is coming from their vestibular system, what you find is that people will perceive center 3 degrees off, 5 degrees off, 10, 15. It was very common for me to test healthy individuals, general population, healthy individuals, even some pretty high-level athletes, and find discrepancies in what they thought was vertical from anywhere from 5 to 15 degrees. Okay. And that's not helpful as soon as your brain starts to take that sensory input and try to integrate it with, let's say, proprioception or vision, right? Sometimes that's when that sensory mismatch occurs. Of course, our brain is going to try to compensate in many different ways to figure out where center is. But that's one example of kind of an accuracy issue with something like the vestibular system that can impact how you hold your body's posture. Because if you're not sure where midline is, or you're not sure where the horizon is, your brain is always going to prioritize higher order systems over basic proprioception. And proprioception is more of a hero. So here's where this really all comes together. Let's say you have some sort of deficit with your vestibular system. And sometimes these are side-to-side differences. So you've got one area of the inner ear, let's say the right side, perceiving something completely different than the left side. Your brain would rather trust and prioritize the vestibular input over the proprioceptive input, and instead of kind of blending the two or relying more on one, your brain will go, hey, proprioceptive system, I need you to be the hero here. I need you to adjust yourself based on what's happening with the higher order systems, the systems that live above you, let's say. And that's when we start to get changes in our body, our proprioception, because our inner ear is not functioning in a balanced way, or even our eyes. So this is when our neck position might change very subtly. Our thoracic
tilt to the side, perhaps.
Yes, yeah. Our thoracic position might change very subtly to accommodate our head and neck position. Think about this as the compensation beginning upstream based on what the inner ear is or isn't telling the brain accurately. And then as we work down the body, we might see all of these compensatory things happening as a countering type of mechanism for what's happening upstream. So any change you make in the head and neck is going to have an influence on the rest of the body downstream of it. So that little itty bitty tilt because somebody is perceiving the horizon wrong, or where center is wrong, or they have some sort of canal issue or otolith issue that's causing that head tilt. We now get a downstream effect, possibly all the way to the feet, as the body tries to reorganize and proprioception becomes that hero. And that strategy is great, but it's not a great long-term strategy. So it may work wonderful at first because we're compensating machines, right? That's what our brain and nervous system is amazing at. But if we're holding the body in a certain way, in that our proprioception, that system that started as the hero, that eventually might be a painful strategy over time, right? And that's when the relationships in our body of, tension and alignment relationships could become changed in some way, that over time you might now be dealing with force in a different way as you walk, as you run, as you move, as you just stand there or sit there. And those are the types of things over time that actually show us that what seems like a seemingly small problem at first can become a larger problem down the road, based on the compensatory strategy.
Yeah, that's a compelling case for why, if I just work on the muscles that I think will change my posture, that it might help and it might feel good, but if it's not changing the underlying problem.
Right. It's only a small part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. So that's why so many of these methods, interventions that are pretty common for the aches and pains that are related to posture, the releasing of muscles, that's why the results of that are often quite temporary. And there's a lot to that. I mean, we've talked about the table dilemma many times now. If I have a posture problem, I've got the kyphosis going on, and then a therapist puts me on the table and releases my pecs. And then I get up off the table. I'm like, wow, that feels really good. I feel looser in the front, and therefore maybe I feel like I'm standing up better. How long can we expect that adjustment to actually last as soon as other sensory systems organize and integrate back in, if my issue is really coming from, let's say, a vestibular problem? As soon as I start to move through the world again, nothing was done to help my vestibular system take in more accurate information. And remember, the brain will always prioritize the higher order stuff over like the local tissue.
Mm-hmm.
So then your brain goes, okay, just put the tension back, please. Because that's our strategy for what's going on.
Be the hero again.
Be the hero again. And that's, some people know that in sort of the therapy world is parking lot syndrome, where you get an adjustment, a manual adjustment or a manual release, or somebody, spends 30 minutes scraping your skin with a tool. You stand up, you feel great, you walk out, you get to your car, and then you're like, oh no, I'm starting to feel that thing again, that pain or that tension. And oftentimes that's why. It's because the posture issue has all these other components to it. It goes far beyond just the muscle or the connective tissues locally.
So we've talked a lot about like a vestibular deficit. Another thing you mentioned earlier was like a visual deficit causing an issue. Could you describe what that might look like?
Sure, yeah. So there's so many different types of actual vision problems. Some of the ones that we are talking about the most are imbalances with eye muscles, right? We have 6 eye muscles, okay, for each eye that move our eyes in all these different directions. And you can have an imbalance there the same way you could have an imbalance anywhere else in the body with a muscle. And a really common thing that we're starting to see now is people are engaging in so much screen time, right?
Mm-hmm.
People have jobs that they sit in front of a screen for 8-9 hours a day. Well, as you're sitting in front of a screen, staring at it, that visual skill is convergence, which is using your eye muscles, your medial recti muscles, to pull your eyes inward so that you can focus on the task in front of you. And so that means you're getting 8 to 9 hours of convergence, and you're getting very little divergence, which is the opposite, which is your eyes moving away from the midline. And you're getting very little accommodation, which is the focusing of near and far, going back and forth, right? So imagine you're out for a walk. Sometimes you're looking at the ground in front of you for a moment. Other times you're looking at the horizon and the mountains, whatever it is that you're looking at, and you're going back and forth, back and forth. That's the focusing that your visual system has to go through, is accommodation. And so for the person sitting at a desk for 9 hours a day, you're not getting a lot of accommodation, which means you're not exercising those muscles involved in accommodation, and you're not getting a lot of divergence. So you could develop kind of a dominance with visual convergence because your eyes are kind of stuck in position for a long time. Now that has body-wide effects, right? Convergence is more related to the body shape of flexion. And it makes sense from a survival standpoint and just a movement standpoint. When you want to focus on something in front of you, you're likely going to be in more of a flexed posture to do that.
Yeah, you're leaning forward.
You're leaning
a little
forward.
bit.
Yeah, there's more tension through the middle of your body, flexing you. There's more tension in the front of your neck. Your head will move forward. And we typically see that posture like that reflexively is very connected to the type of visual skill that we are doing. So with those convergent skills, lots of flexion. When we diverge, well, we actually extend a lot. Imagine looking into the distance, looking at the horizon. You're not going to be in a flexed position really to do that. You're going to be in a more upright, extended position. So we have body positions that kind of follow what the eyes are doing, as well as many other reflexes that are involved in, the eyes moving and then how the body sort of follows the lead of the eyes. So all that is to say, that's an example of how somebody could develop kind of this flexion-based dominance through a lot of practice of a convergence activity. So perhaps that's leading to more forward head posture, right? Or more of a kind of a kyphosis type posture. But here's an interesting one to think about too that I've experienced a lot. You can have muscle imbalances visually, differences in the right and left eyes. So most of our listeners now know one of the basic vision exercises that we teach called pencil push-ups, where you put a pencil in front of your face, you follow it in towards the tip of your nose, and then you follow it back out. So that is the skill of convergence and divergence. And you can have, let's say, an imbalance between your right and left eye where maybe my right eye does not want to converge and my left eye is doing all the work. And that could develop for different reasons, so many reasons. Imagine how if my right eye does not want to converge every time I want it to, and I'm doing something that requires convergence, like looking at my phone. Can you see how my brain would say, no problem, right eye doesn't want to converge. Let me just tell the proprioceptive system to do something different. So yes, exactly. So instead of both eyes working together with good teamwork, rather than investing the energy resources into pulling my right eye in, if it doesn't have the conditioning to do that anymore, my brain will just go, no problem, rotate your head a little bit left. And then my right eye won't have to converge as much. This is ridiculously common. So what happens when I'm that person that's on my phone, or I'm the desk worker that's using that strategy for 8 hours a day? My head now has to rotate left, which means my trunk might have to rotate right, which means my pelvis might have to rotate left. And there's other, examples like how, we might see different changes in the pelvis and shoulders and so on. But you can see how, based on what my eyes are doing, because remember, my brain is going to prioritize that information, my body will change. And it's completely reflexive. It's interesting. We have a tool it's been around a long time. It's called a Brock string. It's a tool that is often used in different forms of vision therapy, where it's a 7 to 10 foot string that you attach to something, and then the other end you touch it to, let's say, the tip of your nose, so that the string is under tension. And on the string is anywhere from 3 to even 10 beads of different colors, and you space them out over the string. And the idea is, as you're holding the string up to your nose and you're looking down the string, you will actually see, hopefully, 2 strings that are crossing at the bead that you're looking at. So we would take people through this as an assessment and even a training drill, and you can move the beads along the string and say, hey, can you see the bead? Yes. Okay. How many strings do you see entering the bead? I see 2. Okay, good. That's the right answer. Are the strings crossing in exactly the right place as they enter the bead? Yes. Great. That's the right answer. How many strings do you see exiting the bead? One. Uh-oh. That's weird. You should see two, because it really should be an X, depending on which bead you're looking at. So then we go, oh, that's interesting. Why is your visual system suppressing some of the information from the visual picture? You should see two, but you're only seeing one. And this is how we start to pick up on suppression issues or like binocular vision issues where both eyes are not working with appropriate teamwork with this idea of convergence. And that's incredibly fatiguing to the brain. And your brain will gladly compensate your way out of that. The string gives us feedback so that we can kind of figure out, okay, what distance is this happening at? Is this happening 6 inches from your face? Is this happening 6 feet from your face? The distance is very specific. But that is an example of how eye muscle imbalances and how the brain is processing the visual picture, because you might have one eye sending a different visual picture to the brain than the other one is. And then your brain goes, whoa, I don't like this. I want both eyes sending the same image with the same accuracy. And when it's not, compensation takes place. And this is the type of vision issue that can become extremely fatiguing for people, extremely fatiguing. And so people who have this type of suppression issue often will report challenges with reading. And sometimes if they fatigue out while they're reading, they'll end up in a very strange postural position to read. And you'll see this with children a lot. If they develop vision problems early on, as they're learning to read and write, they will display a very compensatory strategy with their body. I'm actually watching my daughter very closely right now with all of this, because she's learning to write. She's doing a lot of coloring, and she's been practicing, her letters and stuff. And I'm watching very closely to make sure that as she does that, and it gets difficult and fatiguing, and it should, right? For someone who's developing those skills, we don't want to see any sustained head tilts. We don't want to see her put her head on the table and rest it on her elbow. We don't want to see her resting her head on her other hand. How is the person changing their posture based on what might be an unideal visual picture? And this is how posture kind of follows what's going on with the eyes. But what do? We blame it on the body every single time. And this is just, I have not really seen the industry progress yet with this idea. It's still about the muscles. It's still about the connective tissues. I think the only progression I've seen in the last 15 years is, instead of saying muscles, we say fascia now, because people want to sound more sophisticated and muscles got boring. Right? Because everybody's, no one wants to talk about releasing a muscle and strengthening a muscle anymore. So they jumped to connective tissue and fascia because there's more mystery, right, with the connective tissues, and it's all involved. You can't say one tissue's more important than another. But what really is not being discussed is the higher order parts of posture. Like, how do the eyes impact it? How does the inner ear impact it? And to be quite honest with you, people either don't know what they don't know, right? So it just purely doesn't exist in their life. Just like for me, 16, 17 years ago, when I met a functional neurologist and we were sort of talking shop, and he was asking me about some exercises that might help with someone he was working with. And I was asking him about a client that I had, and he said, that sounds like their vestibular system. And I said, their what? I was doing plenty of vestibular work completely unknowingly to me. Yeah. Right? Because I was training people to move through the world with better quality, but I had no idea what the vestibular system was. And so we haven't got there yet, as a whole. It's still about the muscles. It's still about the connective tissues. There's so much to this idea of posture coming from the brain and coming from all these systems we always discuss, the eyes, the inner ear, the cerebellum, the brainstem. It's all involved.
Yeah, that's pretty revelatory. I think the old school interpretation of like, for example, sitting at a desk
Yeah.
and working at a desk is, if you hunch over, it's because you're kind of lazy. You're kind of
Mm-hmm.
you're not disciplined enough to hold that posture.
Right.
It's like, well, it's not even taking into account that this could be a visual compensation strategy.
Right.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. It also kind of covers what I was going to ask about next, which was just lifestyle stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you've sort of answered some of this already, because, I'm imagining someone that's on the couch a lot,
Mm-hmm.
someone that's sitting all the time, they're in the car all the time, they're not really exercising, they're not
Right.
working out, they're not getting outside much, and you see the posture change. But, I can think of visual reasons why you would do that. If you're always inside, if you're always looking
Yes.
somewhere near, if you're never standing up. I guess the exception here, I would say, is the driving scenario,
Mm-hmm.
where you are looking out in the horizon at further distances.
Right.
But yeah, I can draw a pretty straight line in my mind between what you were just discussing and some of those, what I think people would consider lifestyle posture issues. But yeah, do you have any insights or any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So a sedentary lifestyle is one big giant input problem. That's really what's happening with being sedentary. You're now not receiving all of these different types of input that we are designed to receive on the regular. And so it's one big giant activation problem as far as your brain is concerned. Right? So the person who's more sedentary, they're inside all the time, they're doing a lot of sitting. Sure, those things are not ideal for our body. Right? You are now becoming deconditioned. Right? And you're holding static postures a lot of the time. And we get better at whatever it is we practice, for better or for worse. This is just kind of how the brain and the nervous system work. If you sit all the time and you sit with lousy posture, your brain actually learns how to do that better. All right? No little message shows up. You don't get a text message from your brain that says, "Hey, just so you know, you probably should stand up straighter, sit up straighter, and move around and get some exercise." Like, you don't really know this is happening over time. It's more and more of an input problem, and you get better and better at actually being in that unideal position. So with that sedentary lifestyle comes a very, very big deficit in vestibular input and visual input, because you're just not moving through the world as much as you should be. So there's, the list, it keeps going, right? There's so many inputs that you're not getting as a sedentary individual. And the cumulative effect of this, has body-wide, brain-wide ramifications over time. And all of them affect posture.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this also probably applies to a geriatric population, where maybe their eyesight's going, their balance is going in decline, they're not moving as much, and so you start seeing that same
it's
sort of forward lean posture.
Yeah, it's a more unfortunate example, but it actually is a good one for learning. If you observe an elderly person that is obviously going through this very large input deficit now, they're not getting as much vestibular input, they're not getting as much visual input, and all these other proprioceptive inputs through a lack of movement, you start to see the posture change. And we start to see that kind of stereotypical rounded posture, rounded back, and a forward head type of posture. And really what's happening there is, as the inputs are lost and the systems are deconditioned, our survival mechanisms really kick in and to support us. And so you'll often see elderly folks that are having a lot of vision issues. Basically, they don't want to take their eyes off the ground, right? The ground kind of becomes the focus, because the ground is what's dangerous. And maybe they're dealing with other proprioceptive issues, like let's say blood flow issues in their feet, which are common with that population. And now they can't feel the ground as well, right? All those little sensors on your feet that help you understand where the ground is, they're communicating back to the brain. And the brain's taking that information and blending it and organizing it with what are we getting from the eyes? What are we getting from the inner ear? So you see that person sort of looking at the ground and really essentially getting closer and closer to the ground. And a lot of that is a survival mechanism, because falling will always be the number one threat for a human physically. Mm-hmm. And so the threat is the ground. And that's really what's happening there. So we have to do what we can to continue exposure to dynamic type movements and skills and thinking, and as much as we can, to preserve those systems and hopefully avoid anything out of the ordinary aging process.
Mm-hmm. So I had a question about sitting versus standing, and it's kind of inspired by the table dilemma scenario.
Yeah.
So in the table dilemma that we talk about all the time, someone might be in a horizontal position, they're lying down, they're not loading the spine and the body. And so whatever's being done, maybe won't carry over to when they're standing and loading the body. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, if sitting versus standing, if you're kind of in this different state, can your posture change or be specific to a position like that?
Definitely.
And I would also apply that to standing versus moving.
100%. Posture is specific to position. There's no question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question. And that's why, again, there's so much to it, right? Taking a photo of your posture, standing up, static position, I mean, it gives you clues, right? Posture gives us clues. But when you're sitting, it's going to be different. When you're laying down, it's going to be different. When you're moving, it's going to be different, right? It's just, again, it's a symphony. So it's all these systems working together, right, to create a person's posture depending on what you're doing and how you're using your body. So yes, you will see that posture can, in fact, be very position specific.
Mm-hmm. And then from the opposite direction, could your posture in like a lying down position affect your posture when you're standing or moving? And the main example I have is, does how you sleep matter?
I think when your body's in a position for a long period of time, we have to really consider those positions and activities, right? Because the longer we hold a specific position, the more influence it actually has on our body, right? So yes, I think that the positions we sleep in matter, mainly because this comes down to, a lot of this comes down to breathing. Okay, so we want to make sure that our breathing is optimal at nighttime. And I think position definitely matters for ease of breathing. So people with, some postural issues in the neck and thoracic spine will often really struggle at night to find a position for their head and neck that is most comfortable, that allows them an open airway, right? So airway really matters in this scenario. It's tough when you have a neck that doesn't move, when you have a thoracic spine that doesn't move. Yeah, you've got to really organize a certain way, and sleeping becomes a little bit more, could be more uncomfortable if you are having trouble figuring out those positions. And once your breathing is impacted, breathing, there's so many unconscious repetitions happening during your day or during a night's sleep, right? Mm-hmm. Any activity that is reflexive like that, where you're going to go through thousands and thousands of repetitions, becomes an activity that we're very interested in when it comes to posture, because you're going through so many repetitions, and those repetitions will influence the rest of your body. It's like walking, it's like running, right? It's like chewing, it's like speaking. Breathing is the same way. And we have neural circuitry to help us with these reflexive, rhythmic activities that we don't really need to give any conscious energy towards. You don't need to give conscious energy to breathing, hopefully. If you do, that's not good. Or chewing or speaking or walking. You don't walk and go right foot, left foot, hopefully, right? And so we have literal pattern generation is what it's called. We've got circuitry called central pattern generation at the level of the spinal cord and the brainstem that is designed to help us with these rhythmic kind of automatic type movements in our life so that we don't have to think about them. Locomotion is one of them. That's the main one, is getting from point A to point B, right? It's like the most human thing that we do. Breathing being the most important thing we do for survival. All these are controlled by reflexive systems. So the position our body is in or isn't in, or the way we're moving as we are doing these tasks really matters, because function is one of the things that, let's say, sculpts the body over time, right? Because our body is constantly remodeling itself. And it's movement that has the greatest influence on how our body is going to remodel itself. The way that you walk, let's say, walking, people don't think about this, but walking is actually the single most intense activity that most people do in terms of how much force they deal with on a daily or weekly basis. Comes from walking. Now, some people think, force, that's bad. No, force is good, right? Impact is good. We're supposed to be able to handle impact. And that impact, if our body is working as optimally as it can, the way that energy transfers through the body has a very large impact on how our body remodels itself over time. So we have to think about positions. We have to think about activities that we do that involve a lot of repetitions, because they can help us or even hurt us, depending on how we're going about that.
Mm-hmm. Another potential higher order system. What about auditory deficits?
Oh, that's a good one. That wasn't on my list. That's nice, Tony.
Well, you're talking to a sound guy, so
yeah. So I've got quite a bit of experience with this one, actually, because I find a lot of low grade sound processing issues in the population I work with. And so what that means is they can't hear out of one ear the same way they can out of the other. Sometimes it's literally just they can't take in sound input on one side. Sometimes it's more about mapping of sound, like knowing where a sound is coming from. There's different types of sound processing, and we have different structures that deal with these different types of sound processing. But to keep it simple, we have cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, that's involved in all vestibular activities, but also all auditory type activities. So your ability to put your headphones on and listen to music in both ears stimulates cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 8 has to be healthy for you to process sound accurately. And the rest of the brain is involved in that sound processing. We have an auditory cortex where all of this sound input eventually goes, and it's spread out, even throughout the cortex to other areas too. Different areas of the brainstem, like specifically at the level of the midbrain, which is the top of the brainstem, has a lot to do with tonotopic mapping, which is understanding like, okay, I just heard a bird chirping over there in the tree. Like, what direction did that come from? Mm-hmm. We take that for granted. Someone with a tonotopic mapping problem that cannot distinguish where a sound is coming from, that is very challenging for them to sort out. Right? Because you need to organize all this information, and when things get blurry, it becomes energy expensive. So basic sound processing, if you've got like a hearing deficit in one ear, can you understand how that individual, let's say they cannot hear very well, or they have a small deficit even with their right ear? What the body might do, because the brain knows this, and the brain goes, well, how do we solve this? Well, why don't we rotate the head a little bit to the right? so that we're sort of leading as we move through the world. We're sort of leading with our left ear. We're using the good ear. It's a very simple strategy. Well, like we talked about with the vestibular system and the visual system, what are the downstream effects of the head and neck rotating even just a few degrees, because that's usually what we're talking about here, to the right? Well, maybe the thoracic spine has to rotate left, right? And you see this sort of chain of events taking place as the postural compensation moves down through the rest of the body. And I've seen this a lot. I worked with an athlete for a number of years, and as I started to watch her gait, I noticed something. I said to myself, that's weird. Her ponytail is always off to the right side of her head. I said, that's odd. I wonder if she knows she does that. And I sort of like, after, keep watching, this is over time, and I finally got to part of the evaluation that I discovered some hearing stuff. I discovered that she did, in fact, have a hearing deficit that was relatively significant in one ear. And pretty much everything she did in life was with a rotation. And she always did her ponytails off the side of her head. And I thought the ponytail was I thought it was more like she was doing that and didn't know it. But then I realized, oh no, that's actually showing me too that her head is rotated.
Yeah. I was going to say, if only every athlete had a ponytail, you could see.
Yeah. And it was one of the, it was just one of the features. It was one of the features that made me realize she was doing this, because it can be so subtle. I mean, we might be talking, I've never, I wouldn't be able to really measure the cervical spine and how much is it rotating, like this. But man, I'm guessing we're talking a matter of a few degrees, right? Now, what does that do to your eyes? Because if you're prioritizing what the auditory stimulus coming in from the right ear, and you're moving through life with a head rotation to the right, well, guess what? Now your right eye might not want to converge as much. Now your left eye is stuck in more divergence. And now we're starting to see sort of a visual compensation take place, right? What about the connection between the auditory system and the vestibular system? They operate depending on the same nerve. So we often see with more significant auditory deficits, we sometimes discover vestibular deficits. Sometimes it's the other way around. Which came first? Maybe we don't know. I don't know if we have to know.
Right.
But you see this connection between these systems and how they're compensating. And so a lot of times we're looking for maybe what we believe is primary. Like, what's the most important thing to address here? Because posture really just gives us clues. It doesn't give us answers. So you have to be able to look at it and go, well, I see that head rotation, and I've taken a history and I've learned some stuff about them. And, I'm starting to theorize, maybe there is a hearing deficit here. I need to check that, right? And we have basic ways of doing that. Maybe there is a vision problem here, and we have extensive ways of checking that. Maybe there's a vestibular problem. We have extensive ways of checking that. And you're just taking the information and you're trying to figure out, like, what are the primary concerns here, and how can we design training that starts to essentially make these systems smarter, so that your brain can become more confident in the information that it's taking in, which is really this whole idea, going back to what you said earlier about sensory mismatch. It's this whole idea of clarifying all the maps. That's what it is. And when you clarify all the maps to the best of your ability, doesn't even have to be perfect. It never will it will never need to be perfect, right? Because compensation is normal. It's just that when compensation gets out of control and the deficits get too large, we see problems come up. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but if we can clarify all the maps, and understand these different structures that are involved in posture, then we have a really good chance of changing posture and getting more long-term change. dealing with a lot of these higher order things that might be going on versus just releasing the muscle and expecting it to stick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have many episodes talking about like the vestibular system, for example, and drills that you can do. We have episodes on the visual system and things you can do there.
Definitely.
So there's lots of places to start if you suspect one of these things.
For sure.
I had a question about another scenario. So let's say someone's body is asymmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
Their left femur is longer than their right femur, for example. Something like that, or they have a slight scoliosis.
Yeah.
So structural differences that could lead to a posture. Based on what you've discussed, I could see how that slight postural asymmetry could then lead to a vestibular or a visual or both kind of compensatory deficit.
Right.
Is there a different strategy you would use when there's a structural asymmetry there?
Yeah, a structural issue is sort of driving the higher order then problem?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Because a lot of times we're talking about it the other way around.
Yes, it's a two-way street.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, in this scenario, is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah, so, okay, let's start with scoliosis. This is a good one. So typically we would look at a scoliosis as mainly a proprioceptive problem, a structural issue that is maybe driving postural problems in other higher order things. And we can't even think like that. We can't even think about scoliosis like that anymore now that we know more about the nervous system and these different systems. I think there's probably several reasons, many reasons why somebody could develop a scoliosis. But a lot of times with scoliosis, you get the kind of idiopathic title to it. We're not really sure why you have it, but you have it. And there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion about where does it actually come from. There's lots of different theories. What we're starting to see more now, and I'm not saying this is the only reason to have that someone could have scoliosis, but what we're starting to see more now is the connection between how the eyes and the inner ear might in fact be driving the structural change of the spine, which makes a lot of sense when you look at the neuroanatomy of this and how your eyes and the inner ear are speaking directly to the spine, because your spine is always adjusting and going through these changes based on what your eyes and your inner ear are telling your brain. So imagine kind of going back to the original thing that I described with, let's say you have an inner ear problem that is causing a deficit. You aren't totally sure where center is or where the horizon is, or you've got semicircular canal dysfunction or otolith dysfunction that's changing how your brain is perceiving the way you're moving through space. And it's changing your body's position based on that as a survival mechanism to try to compensate as good as it can. In a person who is developing and growing, you can understand how, like a tree that is impacted by the elements, we've all been out hiking and seen a tree that was sort of leaning in the path of the wind, right? You've seen many trees like that have been influenced by other factors, the way the tree grows based on the type of terrain it's on. You see some really amazing compensatory strategies of the tree to where they grow. I mean, we were out hiking just last weekend and there were giant trees essentially growing out of the side of rock cliffs, right? And then because it was a gorge and it had wind that cut through the gorge all the time. And the trees were literally bent in that direction that the wind was influencing them the most. I kind of think about it like that. Your eyes and your inner ear are influencing the growth of the spine based on how the brain is perceiving the external environment. So this is one thing that we're starting to learn more and hear more about now. So yes, it can be a two-way street, but even in that scenario, I think what we're learning is that a lot of the spinal issues and scoliosis is actually coming from the influence that the spine is getting from the inaccurate information coming from the eyes and the inner ear. So that's one idea to consider. That's a very big one for anyone who's working with individuals that have scoliosis. I've tested a lot of people with scoliosis, and they always, I put it this way, I have never tested somebody with scoliosis that did not have either a vision or a vestibular deficit or both.
Mm-hmm.
Never seen that. So it's interesting to me. Again, two-way street. Which came first? I can't really say, but the connection is quite obvious to me there now, having seen that. So the other example you said was sort of like the structural one, like the longer femur or whatever. Mm-hmm. It changes input, right? I think it has an impact, and the body's going to compensate for it. Interestingly enough, I've heard from a lot of clients that they have a leg length discrepancy. I'll hear this a lot on histories and stuff, and I always ask them, like, so where'd you get that information? Like, did you work with somebody that was able to measure your bones and figure this out? And they're like, no, not really. I was just told by my doctor or my chiropractor or whatever that I have a leg length discrepancy. And you want to know what it really came down to? Was a change in pelvic positioning. That's just my experience. I'm not saying that these structural deficits do not exist. They absolutely can. Most of the time, for me, working with the general population, and I hear this, their pelvis is asymmetric, and it is then it then looks like, or feels like, or whatever, that they have a leg length discrepancy, and so the person is kind of thinking, "Oh, I must have one leg that's longer, one leg that's shorter." For the folks I've worked with, that's typically what I've seen. Now, pelvic asymmetry is a huge topic and is very much a big posture conversation. A lot of people struggle with pelvic asymmetry. And pelvic asymmetry, to some degree, we could say is normal. The human body is not designed to be perfectly symmetric. It's, when you look at the anatomy, there's lots of different reasons. The way we breathe, our organs, the way that where our organs are in our body, all of these have an influence on the body not being perfectly symmetric. And then you add in all this compensatory stuff happening from all these, our history, our experiences, our injuries, our emotions, all this stuff goes into it. And no body is going to be the same, right? And we see pelvic asymmetry all the time. Some level of pelvic asymmetry, again, I've kind of put in the normal category. When the deficits get too large, then they become a problem, because the pelvis is a very important structure. It's where a lot of force crosses in the body with locomotion. And there's a lot of anatomy there. Breathing involves the, pelvic positioning, has a big influence on it. There's all sorts of stuff that we could unpack there at some point. But pelvic positioning is a large driver for changes that we see in other places in the body, whether it's the feet, whether it's the spine, the head, the neck, the jaw. Certainly impacts it. One of the structures that I feel is very much involved in the pelvic asymmetries that we often see is the brainstem. We haven't talked about it in this episode yet. It's a big driver of posture, because very reflexively the brainstem is involved in global tone of tissue, global tone of muscles, reflexive stabilization, even more like automatic type things like breathing and blood pressure, right? All these sort of autonomic type functions. Brainstem's heavily involved in these things. They all impact posture. We are quite accustomed to seeing that when someone has what we call a PMRF dysfunction, which means usually for us, one side of the brainstem is not functioning optimally, or let's say it's underperforming, we see changes in posture because of that. The pelvis is pretty influenced by the PMRF. So one of the things that we kind of go deeper into in our courses is that when it comes to the brainstem, we're very much interested in training it for improving posture. And the brainstem has a lot to do with setting muscle tone above the level of T6 of the spinal cord and below it, but quite specifically. So when the brainstem's doing its job well, it will facilitate appropriate extensor tone above T6. And when it's doing its job well in the lower body, it will facilitate appropriate muscle tone. Again, this is a balance of flexors and extensors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for example, somebody with a PMRF dysfunction on the right side of the body may demonstrate a loss of extensor tone above T6, which leaves them with maybe that shoulder drooping because they've lost tone in the upper trap. You might see a loss of flexor tone below T6, and you may start to see that in the trunk. So maybe they have a hard time reflexively stabilizing around the pelvis. And they tell you they have tight hip flexors, right? How many people say that? Because the tone is not balanced appropriately, and they carry a lot of increased tone in the low back, like the spinal extensors. So then you start seeing that classical sort of anterior pelvic tilt, right? Where someone's really tight in their lower back, and they're tight in their hip flexors. We even see with this posture, the lower body the limbs tend to rotate outward. So if you have more of a PMRF posture in the lower body, you'll usually see that as the duck foot on that side because their leg is rotated out more. In the upper body, you get the drooping shoulder. You also get an internal rotation of the humerus, a little bit of increased elbow flexion along with wrist flexion and even pronation of the forearm, sometimes even increased finger flexion. So it kind of looks like this claw hand, right, with some excessive tone in the arm. These are all postures that we are trained to see that give us clues about what structures might be most important to start to train. So going after the actual structure, the PMRF, we can do that in a ton of different ways. And then proprioceptively knowing where does it make sense to work on extensor tone? Where does it make sense to work on flexor tone instead of trying to do it all, right? It's nice to be able to understand the pattern and then see, okay, this based on what we know and the history and the assessments, we can see that we have to help this person with more extensor tone above T6. We have to decrease extensor tone below T6, maybe increase flexor tone in the lower body. So it's great to be able to understand the structures, the neuroanatomy, and sort of pick your targets.
Yeah. And it's not dissimilar, at least in approach in this way, from kind of what I call the classical model, where it's like, oh, we want to increase, the erectors here.
Right.
And so somebody might look at that as we need to strengthen those muscles.
Right.
You're saying, well, we need to do that, but the way to do that would be to stimulate the PMRF on this side.
Exactly. And that's where...
And that's the difference.
That's the difference.
That's the disconnect.
That's the disconnect, because you're using a higher order input and you're directing it at the structure that controls the muscles. That's why biomechanics matter, right? But you really have to look at them as neurobiomechanics once you get to this point of understanding all these systems, because biomechanics are going to be influenced by the control centers, right? And it's always going to be a two-way street to some degree,
right?
Because inputs coming in as how you receive input is going to have an effect on this whole equation. But the control mechanisms for how we move come from the brain. Like literally, this is what's, people need to know there are brain centers that control locomotion, right? So let's say you're trying to help somebody walk better. or run better, wouldn't you want to know what brain center helped that happen? And if you did know that, and you could reach into your toolbox and select all these different inputs that activated that mesencephalic locomotor region in the midbrain, that helped a person walk better and swing their arms better in the right timing, you have a toolbox full of all these tools that you can direct at that area and then see immediate changes in gait. And immediate changes in gait that you can get the person to keep facilitating. Remember we talked about, I didn't say it this way when we talked about it, but ground force math, how much force you're dealing with on each step as you walk. Now you're changing a person's gait and you're letting force be the ultimate remodeler of the body over time. So that's why understanding the neural structures involved in movement and posture is so key, because by activating those things and getting those changes sometimes immediately, you are influencing how a person moves, making them more efficient. So then the natural process can occur. You're helping them move better, and force is starting to change their body over time. When you change somebody's movement over time, you're expanding the movement box. You're giving them more options. And as soon as they get more options, what? They're taking in more input. So it's this whole journey, right? This whole process that takes place where the movement box is expanding. It's now taking in more input. A person's options become larger, right? They can adapt better. They can make all these new movement choices that bring in new input and help the whole process unfold. Right. So that's how I think about it. Right. It's not just what can we do in the moment, release the muscle here, strengthen it there, and hope it sticks. It's how do we influence where those commands are coming, and then use the increased quality of movement to sculpt the changes that we want over time.
Yeah. So your process with someone that wants to work on their posture would be, in just very general terms, kind of along the lines of taking a history and making assessments.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to figure out what those control centers are doing and which ones are functioning well and which one could use some work.
Exactly.
And then you would find entry points that you would assess, right? But you might do, you mentioned pencil push-ups. If you realize there's a visual deficit that could be contributing to their posture,
right,
that's like a drill that you could do. There's drills for the vestibular system. There's drills for the PMRF.
Mm-hmm.
There's drills for the cerebellum. There's also cerebellar patterns in gait. We have a whole episode on gait assessments, by the way,
Yes.
which should really be a companion to this episode.
Definitely.
Because it gets really into that.
Yeah, it talks about the cerebellum, talks about the PMRF. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so basically, there isn't one like, okay, if you want to fix your posture, do X. It's If you want to fix your posture, figure out what these higher order systems are doing and how they might be contributing, and then find an entry point that addresses one or more of those.
Yeah, for the professional who's working with clients on improving posture, that's exactly how you go about it. Find those underperforming systems, and when you do, just sort of analyze that, and you'll likely see why their posture has changed, right? And why they're expressing the body shape that they are. Yeah, it's great to be able to see those patterns and understand things a little bit more and get those clues.
Mm-hmm. So the thing with deficits that may not be clear, right, is how much can you actually improve them or fix them?
Yeah.
If you have a vestibular system that's not performing, for example, in your experience, is there a limit to what can be done with kind of exercises and drills?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it really just a matter of time and targeted practice?
This is a tough one. I think it's all relative to, there's so many factors that go into this. So I always feel like no matter what, improvement can be made. That's just where I'm at now. No matter what, people message me all the time, and I feel like some people are trying to prove to me that they're going to be the hardest case I've ever experienced in my life, and they're so problematic. They're a total mess. Nothing works. I hear these stories all the time, and it doesn't affect me. I hear the history, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot. That's intense. Like, I'm probably 5 minutes away from finding a stimulus that's going to help you, because something always helps. Mm-hmm. Not everything, but something always does. And sometimes it's harder than that. But everybody can make improvements. Now, how much? This is just such a big question that I don't even know if you can answer it, because there's so many factors, right? There's lifestyle, there's all this stuff we didn't talk about. There's psychology, there's emotion, there's all these things that have an impact on how we perceive, the world, right? Our bodies are the brain is a very prediction-based organ that is wired more for survival than anything else. And the way that we perceive life, whether, our nervous system is always asking this question, am I safe or not? That's kind of how it's monitoring every moment. Am I safe or not? Can I move from point A to point B? And what's coming next? Those are really the questions that are always being asked. And that kind of level of protection that is sort of hardwired into humans has a really big influence on posture and long-term results. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, metabolic health has an enormous impact on long-term results. Okay. And that's a whole nother thing, right? It's a whole nother thing, but can your system handle the change? Because we assume that any change we make, the body can just handle. And that's not how it works metabolically. Your brain actually would rather not change. That's what makes this whole thing so challenging. It would rather stay the way that it is, because as far as it's concerned, for this next moment, that is the safest strategy.
Right. It's already decided that.
Yeah.
It's already compensated.
Yeah. And if you're an individual that has underlying health concerns, whatever those might be, that affect your metabolic health, and so many people do, you could argue most, right? At this point, there's always something, right? There's always something. Mm-hmm. And those factors really come into play with long-term results, because sometimes your brain kind of runs through this equation and figures out that you don't necessarily have the energy resources to maintain a long-term result at this point, because there's other processes that it has to prioritize. So why should it prioritize a deeper squat or standing up straighter when it needs to do other things? And that's going to be energy expensive. So this is a conversation that is ongoing in our community and in our courses, because we have to know how to support people with better metabolic health so that we can use the tools we know how to use and get results more long-term. And you'll see when you start to do this work, some people adapt to change very quickly and easily. They're usually the healthier client, whereas somebody else might struggle with that. And they might be in chronic pain longer. They might experience more pain. They might experience results that, they get results, but then those results kind of go away. That's very typical for people that have different metabolic issues. So it's a question that is not really possible to answer. And all I can say is everybody can get better, and better is better, right? With posture, we're not going for perfection. Ideally, we're going for an improvement. We're going for less pain. And I think that everybody can do that, right? And it's sometimes not even going to look drastic, right? It's like, I sort of got out of this mentality years ago of we have to fix everything. Because then I realized, we're probably never completely fixing something, right? And that's okay. We don't actually have to fix something completely. But I've learned that if we can improve something, there are very positive consequences to that. It's like globally, right? You improve one thing and the whole system adapts to that one thing. And then we move to the next. And that's acceptable. All right. That's acceptable. So the only way you're going to know what's possible is if you start and keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's no finish line to this because as a human, we have to continually earn a pain-free body that can move and that can express a better posture. There's no finish line to that. We have to keep earning it over and over and over again, which is very important to know. It's not a set of exercises you're going to do for 6 months and then it's yours. That's not how it works. We have to keep influencing the way that the body is holding its posture through all these different sensory systems and exposure to all these different things, including making healthy lifestyle choices and, some of the things that, we didn't talk about today, like what's your environment like and who do you spend time with? Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
There's all these factors come into play, with what's going on in your, in your mind, right? What is your self-talk?
Yeah. Sure.
All that plays into posture. And so there's no finish line to this. It's pick something, work on it, move to the next thing, continue the journey.
We talk a lot about high payoff drills.
Yeah.
And for the people that have high payoff drills that are just kind of always useful and it's consistent, over the years, I wonder if that's because it's like, okay, I have this low grade deficit somewhere and it's not going away. It just is. But this drill provides some clarity, some stimulation, whatever it is to that part of the brain. And therefore, that's always kind of the first thing in my toolbox that I reach for.
Yes.
When I want to make an improvement. And so, as much as it would be nice for that drill to you just do it once and then you never have to do it again.
Right.
It seems like built into that idea is this idea that you might have a deficit that doesn't actually resolve completely.
Yes. Yeah. And that's okay. Right. A lot of times we can just improve the system and that's enough, and other times, like you said, we maybe haven't found a stimulus yet, or we even haven't had enough consistency yet, or our metabolic health has not reached a healthy enough point yet where it's harder to hold on to that result. But we can still use that and leverage that. And that's perfectly okay too. That's a good thing. I sometimes laugh because, I hear all this hater talk on Instagram with some of the stuff. And one of the common things you sometimes hear from people is like, hey, that's only going to provide temporary relief. I'm sorry, is that bad? What kind of temporary relief did you have before this, right? Like it's almost like it's looked at as a bad thing.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with temporary relief. You just started a process and one thing always leads to the next, right? I had written something recently on Instagram about, there's not really, we can't really find root causes necessarily. It's too hard to sort out.
Right.
It's too hard to sort. I used to have the mentality of I'm going to find the root cause and I'm going to fix it. And then I realized, in such a compensatory machine like a human, how could you ever know if you're finding the root cause? And things are so holistic. When we improve one area, that impacts another. It's more of an ecosystem type of relationship. This is huge to know. And it shouldn't be overwhelming. It actually should be freeing. Right? I know that I'm experiencing a lot of that right now. I've made so many good, helpful, nutritional decisions for myself in the last 5 months. And the impact that has had on myself physically has been kind of shocking. Like I told someone recently, the best thing I ever did for my hip mobility was not hip mobility. Best thing I ever did for my hip mobility was improve my gut health. Okay. Now, this is coming from somebody that I've been doing hip mobility for like actual focused hip mobility type stuff, I don't know, 18 years, where I'm actually like thinking hip mobility, like I should do something for hip mobility. And yeah, I am more mobile than the average person, right? But not extremely, like you're not seeing me like jump up in the air and land in a split. Mm-hmm. But I have reasonably good mobility in most areas. And I've been working on this stuff for a long time. Best thing I ever did for my hip mobility was improve my gut health. Right? That's an example of what I mean here about ecosystems and how things, are connected. And, I've seen lots of interesting things like that with people. It's fascinating, which is why you have to really look at things holistically and find, where do you need the attention? And it's fun because in improving that one area, that's gonna positively impact another.
Yeah. I often think of it as the inverse of, these compensations you've been talking about. Like, okay, you have an auditory deficit in your left ear, so you tilt, and that means that your eyes compensate and don't do what they're supposed to in the same way.
Right.
And your vestibular system and the way that you turn your spine and therefore your pelvis and therefore your foot. And it's kind of like, man, that one deficit just caused all of these compensatory changes that aren't great, Well, it works in reverse also. You fix this one thing or you improve this one thing and suddenly all those other downstream effects get better too.
And typically when you see that, because I have seen that, like that's usually a good clue that you've found something very primary. Mm-hmm. that your brain and nervous system has put a lot of weight on that, and that's a really good indication. And sometimes it works the other way. You don't find the hearing deficit, but you do find the visual deficit. You do the vision stuff. Yeah, you're getting a result, but this seems like it could be better. And then maybe we haven't discovered the hearing issue yet, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to continue to test the systems to learn about the person as a whole. So yeah, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to consider. Posture, it's a whole symphony of things that work, together and influence how we actually present ourselves and how well we maintain and hopefully win that fight against gravity.
Any final thoughts?
Your posture is your signature is a quote that came from Dr. Igor Burdenko, who was one of the largest influences on me early on when I was making the transition from what is thought to be normal mainstream, training, right? At the time I was in college thinking I was going the route of strength and conditioning coach, right? Sort of, I remember taking classes to prepare for the CSCS, and I had met Tom, who I've talked about several times in the podcast, who was my first introduction into the Burdenko method. And then through him met Igor and worked with Igor. One of the first things he said to me is, your posture is your signature. I didn't know really what he meant and at the time, but it sounded interesting. And now I do. There's so much that goes into it in how a person is presenting themselves posturally. It gives us clues. It doesn't give us answers, but there's a lot of clues that we can get from it.
Awesome.
All right, there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode on posture. I think we'll probably be back to this topic at some point because there is still a lot more to discuss, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you guys will be so kind, if you've been enjoying the podcast, make sure to give us a review. Those reviews go a really long way for us. We really appreciate it. And you listening, all the support's been great. I've been hearing from many of you guys in my direct messages and over on YouTube and through email that you're really enjoying the podcast, and we're happy about that. So we do love hearing from you. Don't be a stranger if you have ideas or questions, and keep your eyes peeled because now we've added this Q&A this Q&A episode, right, once a month. So we're going to be putting out feelers on social media to get more questions from you. But head on over, give us a review. That would be great. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back soon.